All Henry could do was to watch the trains rushing through the other tunnel. He was very sad because he thought no one would ever see his lovely green paint with red stripes again.
The Reverend W. Audrey had a great deal of trouble with Henry. Originally, Audrey had illustrated him as a 442 Atlantic. However, William Middleton would change this when he illustrated him as a 462 Pacific, looking very similar to Gordon. Audrey was especially unhappy with Reginald Dalby's illustrations, as you can see here, he looked almost identical to Gordon, even more so while he was painted blue, but this was passed off by explaining he needed to use Gordon's buffers while he was being repaired. Apparently. To make matters worse, he was illustrated inconsistently, often having several different shapes within the span of a single story. Not to mention, in most of Dalby's illustrations, he would be portrayed incorrectly as a 460 instead of a 462. Because of all of this, Audrey's original idea had been to write out Henry, but by Henry the Green Engine, he had decided to instead have Henry involved in a serious accident, allowing him to be rebuilt into a Class 5 MT, as this was an actual real locomotive, and thus forcing Dalby to be consistent. Following this, Audrey would base all of his locomotives and characters off of real-life prototypes. Unfortunately, the issues with Henry were just starting to unfold, however. In the book The Island of Sodor, Its People, History, and Railways, it said that Henry was an experimental locomotive, and built from plans that were stolen from Sir Nigel Gresley, but the wrong plans were actually taken, and the locomotive that would end up being built was so riddled with issues that the only person who could be persuaded to buy it was the Fat Controller, who at the time was desperate for any locomotive that he could get. There is a certain amount of argument over Henry's rebuild that's also caused by this book. Audrey claimed that the pre-rebuild and post-rebuild Henry were actually two completely separate engines. Although in the Railway series, Henry seemed familiar with the events that happened before the crash. Henry's memory could have simply survived the rebuild, but as both sources can be considered equally canon, the question of whether there have been one or two Henrys will likely remain unanswered. The Reverend himself would say that the whole ordeal was a mystery. Audrey would build his Henry out of a second-hand Graham Farish Black 5. Much like the fictional character, the model itself was temperamental, and performed very iffily. By the late 1950s, the motor had completely given out. Audrey was in the middle of fixing it when he became bedridden before his eventual death, and the model itself was lost for 2 decades. However, in 2019 the model was found, being in the Audrey Study exhibit at the Narrow Gauge Railway Museum on the Talon Railway. It now sits in the Twin Narrow Gauge Museum in a notably decrepit condition, but that's also how Audrey left it. Like most others, Henry's original Gauge 1 model was a custom build, featuring a custom-made Perspex body shell and Markland locomotive parts. He was painted with car body paint, and lined with red automotive pinstripe tape, with his numbers being cut from custom vinyl stickers. Henry's main chassis was sourced from a Gauge 1 locomotive made by Markland, this being the BR-78, while his tender wheels were sourced from the tender of the BR-55. The buffer beams and dome would also come from the BR-78. His model was built with the ability to switch between his old and new shape, due to the series being filmed out of sequence. His old shape features splashers, a tapered firebox, and no top feed or exterior steam pipes, while his new shape did have the top feed and exterior steam pipes as well as a bell pair firebox, just this time with no splashers. Henry's Perspex model was originally AC powered, and actually required a polarity switch which was found in the tender. However, during a refurbishment the motor was switched to DC, this being done to allow easier running and maintenance. During their production of the 10th season, 2 new models were built, as the original Henry model at this point was 22 years old. His new models would be made out of brass, and like the other engines, would be equipped with a CNC machined aluminum chassis. 18 different facial expressions will be sculpted for Henry, although only 17 were ever used on screen, as Henry had 2 variants of his surprised face, with the latter being made from the same sculpt as the sneezing face. The faces would first be sculpted in clay and then molded in silicone, and several duplicates of Henry's faces will be made in case they needed one to be dirty and one to be clean. I'm happy to say that 2 of Henry's original faces are now owned by Thomas Tank Merch. A close-up model of Henry would be built in the 4th season, and was originally made in pieces so it could be easily dismantled or reassembled. It would appear in the 5th, 7th, and 8th season. Unfortunately, I'm not sure what would become of this model or the models before it. However, as we all know and most loathe, in 2009 the television series would introduce CGI, and Henry would be recreated from scratch by Nitrogen Studios. His CGI model is honestly mostly identical to his Gauge 1 model, but does have slight modifications. As of season 24, Henry has actually been removed from the Steam team, unfortunately to make room for Rebecca, just as they had done with Edward using Nia. And after figuring out so much about Henry and how integral he was to the show, as well as the lore behind Thomas and Friends, I can say with almost 110% certainty, this bitch will not live up to those expectations. This is an irreplaceable character, and though it's unfortunate the show would have you believe that he is, people who grew up with Thomas and Friends will always have a soft spot for Henry, and hopefully for the history behind him as well, as no other character shares such an interesting dynamic. Gone from the official Steam team, maybe, but from our hearts,
No.
Thank you guys again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.